Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We are really excited to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. We've got a really fascinating topic lined up.
We absolutely do. So today, we are exploring a really interesting methodology for language acquisition. It was developed by A.J. Hoji. He's the creator of the Effortless English Club.
Right, and it's basically a complete rethinking of how we learn.
Exactly. Our mission today is to really unpack his concept of, well, what he calls high-intensity training for language learning. We're going to explore how principles that are usually reserved for, like, professional athletes can actually be used to shortcut your path to fluency.
It's a really unique perspective, applying physical training concepts to cognitive tasks.
I know, applying gym terminology like powerlifting and sprinting to brain training. Okay, let's unpack this, because I am instantly hooked.
It's definitely a compelling hook. But to set the context before we dive in, I think it's important to note something about the source material.
Right, what's the broader context here?
Well, while Hoagie's materials are very specifically about learning English, the underlying philosophy we're talking about today, this idea of intense focus versus burnout, it's applicable to mastering literally any complex skill.
Oh, for sure. So if you're trying to learn Python programming or, advanced woodworking, this still applies to you.
Exactly. It's about how the brain adapts to extreme demands.
So let's move straight into the first big concept here, which is this high-intensity language regimen. What does high intensity actually mean when it comes to just like sitting down and reading or listening?
Yeah, so Hoagie defines this as a challenge period. Usually he's talking about a 4-month window of maximum language intensity.
Okay, 4 months. That doesn't sound too crazy.
Well, the duration isn't the crazy part, it's the volume. You're aiming for hundreds or even thousands of quality hours of input during those 4 months.
Thousands. Wait, really?
Yeah, it's staggering. In the sources, he actually shares some specific leaderboard stats from his community to show what this intensity looks like in practice.
Oh, I saw those numbers. They are wild. Let's share some of those with the listener.
Sure, so you have a learner named Julia Lehman, and she logged 18 hours.
18 hours of listening. Just boom.
Right. And then Rafiko Islam with 16 hours. Hogyu himself talks about doing 14 hours over 2 days, so that's 7 hours a day of pure focused input.
Which is basically a full-time job.
It really is. Oh, and there's another learner who goes by the name Spin, who combined 11 hours of listening with 4 hours of reading.
15 hours in one go. See, I have to play the skeptic here for a second. If I am studying Japanese for 7, 8, or 15 hours a day, won't my brain just completely melt? It feels like trying to drink from a fire hose.
It absolutely feels like that at first, and that's actually the point. It's very similar to physical training.
How so? Like the powerlifting analogy.
Exactly. If a powerlifter lifts a massive weight for short reps, or a runner does a 100% effort sprint for 30 seconds, they are shocking their system. What's fascinating here is the psychological strategy behind that cognitive shock.
Okay, so the brain melt is intentional.
Yes, you are purposefully overwhelming the brain's normal filters. When you do that, you force the brain to adapt incredibly quickly. It stops seeing the language as a casual puzzle and starts treating it like vital environmental data.
Oh, I see. So because it's coming at you so fast, your brain basically panics and says, I need to understand this to survive.
Precisely. And because the brain adapts so fast under that pressure, it produces rapid, very tangible results. You notice yourself improving week to week, sometimes day to day.
And I imagine that's huge for motivation.
It's everything. Those quick results are the ultimate fuel. It creates a positive feedback loop that casual studying, like 20 minutes of flashcards a day, just simply doesn't trigger.
Right, because with 20 minutes a day, 6 months go by and you still can't watch a movie, so you just quit.
Exactly. The intensity bypasses that slow death of motivation.
Okay, but building off that danger of a melting brain we just talked about, you can't sprint forever. If I sprint for 4 months, I'm going to hit a wall. So how does someone actually sustain this method without just burning out and quitting entirely?
That is the crucial second half of the equation. You cannot do high intensity forever. Hoagie is very clear about the necessity of breaks.
So what does a break look like in this context? Do you just stop completely?
Not completely, but you drop the intensity significantly. For example, after a brutal 4-month challenge, he suggests using the December and January holiday season as a recovery period. You drop down to a very relaxed, low-intensity maintenance level before you ramp up for a new challenge in the spring.
That makes total sense. You have an off-season, just like an athlete.
Right. But there's also a philosophical element to avoiding burnout during the challenge itself, which he borrows from Taoism. It's the concept of wu wei.
Ah, yes. Effortless effort.
Exactly. The idea is that the effort shouldn't be agonizing, it should be enjoyable, so the learning almost happens automatically.
See, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because we are so conditioned to think that if studying isn't painful, it
Right.
isn't working.
We definitely have that bias. But Hoagie gives a great personal example of how he uses this. He was studying Japanese, and he admits that he gets bored and frustrated really easily.
Same here, honestly.
Right. So his strategy is to constantly switch his inputs. He doesn't just grind through one boring textbook. He does his intense, difficult listening at night when he's focused. But then, for a break, he'll go to a coffee shop in the afternoon and do some slow, really relaxing reading.
He changes the environment and the medium.
Exactly. He's balancing the load. And this ties into a specific framework he uses, which he calls deep and wide learning.
Okay, deep and wide. And the source mentions this is actually compared to the linguist Steve Kaufman's idea of repetition and novelty, right?
Yes, they are very similar concepts. So deep learning means lots and lots of repetition of easier material. You are listening to the same core stuff over and over to completely internalize the basic grammar and sounds.
You're carving that deep groove in your brain.
Right. But if you only do that, you get bored out of your mind. So that's where the wide part comes in. Wide means consuming a huge variety of topics.
To build vocabulary and just keep things interesting.
Exactly. It prevents boredom, which maintains that wu-wei, that effortless effort.
You know, it reminds me of how traditional schooling forces you to run on a treadmill you just hate. You're forced to read dry textbooks, and it's agonizing. But what's so empowering about Hoagie's advice here is that he basically says, if you hate a book or a podcast, just abandon it.
Yes, drop it immediately and find something you actually like. And that is so important right now, especially when we look at human attention spans.
Oh, don't even get me started on attention spans.
Well, the sources point out that our internet and smartphone usage is basically destroying our concentration. We're trained to scroll and swipe every 3 seconds.
It's so true. I can barely get through a long article anymore.
But reading, especially sustained reading in a target language, actively rebuilds that concentration. Varying the medium, switching from an intense audiobook to a fun podcast to a physical book, is a highly strategic way to bypass mental fatigue while repairing your attention span.
That is such a great reframe. It's not just learning a language, it's basically rehabbing your brain.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered the internal mechanics, the intensity, the breaks, the effortless effort. But let's pivot to the messy real world. How does A.J. Hoagie actually advise applying these skills out in the wild?
This is where the methodology really proves itself, because the real world is full of friction, and the sources give some really practical examples of how to navigate that.
Let's start with the big one, raising bilingual kids. So many parents stress about this, thinking they need formal lesson plans.
Right, but his advice is actually incredibly simple. He recommends the one parent, one language rule.
Okay, so how does that work in practice?
Well, let's say the dad is a native English speaker, and the mom speaks Vietnamese or Japanese. The rule is that the dad only ever speaks English to the child, and the mom only ever speaks her native language.
Oh, wow, so it's a strict division.
Very strict, because the child's brain is highly pragmatic. If a parent switches back and forth, the kid will just default to whatever language is easier.
That makes sense. They'll just take the path of least resistance.
Exactly. But if dad only speaks English, the child realizes, oh, I have to use English to connect with dad. It makes the language a natural necessity for the relationship, rather than an artificial lesson.
It's environmental design. You're setting up the environment so the language just naturally occurs.
Precisely.
And that idea of natural environmental design leads perfectly into his travel strategy. Because usually when people travel to practice a language, they end up just being a tourist in a big city, ordering coffee in broken Spanish.
Right, the classic tourist bubble. You never actually have a real conversation.
Exactly. So Hoji says, don't just be a tourist, find a hobby to force interaction.
It's such a smart bypass.
It really is. The source gave this great example of Hoagie walking the Camino de Santiago in Spain.
Right, the big pilgrimage route.
Yeah, and it's exhausting, right? You're walking miles and miles a day. But because everyone is doing this shared grueling activity, it strips away the normal social barriers. You naturally start talking to locals in Spanish because you're all suffering together.
Shared adversity is an amazing icebreaker.
Totally. And he had another example from Hawaii. He and his wife were there, and instead of just sitting by the pool, they took a local lime-making class.
Oh, making the flower necklaces, right.
Yeah. And because their hands were busy and they were engaged in this shared physical task with the locals, it sparked all these natural, completely effortless English conversations for his wife.
It takes the pressure off. You aren't staring at each other trying to think of the right verb tense. You're just making a necklace and chatting. It's wu-wei in action.
Exactly. Okay, so that covers speaking and listening in the real world. But what about when you have to sit down and produce the language formally? The source material talks about academic writing versus effective writing, and Hogan has a pretty strong opinion here.
Very strong. He basically says that if you want to be a great writer, you should emulate Ernest Hemingway, not a university professor.
Right, keep it simple and clear.
Yes. Academics often use incredibly complex, obscure words and convoluted sentences. But Hoagie argues they do that mostly just to look intelligent.
It's about ego, not communication.
Exactly. Their writing often fails to actually communicate effectively because it's so dense. Hemingway, on the other hand, wrote with brutal simplicity to make sure his ideas were instantly understood.
So the goal is clarity, not showing off your vocabulary.
Right. And that philosophy even extends to how he advises people to prep for standardized tests, like the IELTS or the TOEFL.
Oh, test prep. The bane of every student's existence. What's his approach there?
Instead of just grinding through grammar workbooks, he says you should read nonfiction books and listen to audiobooks on really diverse topics.
What kind of topics?
History, science, economics, psychology.
Which goes back to the wide learning concept we talked about earlier.
Exactly. By reading widely and complex subjects, you naturally internalize advanced vocabulary and grammar structures in their actual context, rather than memorizing isolated rules for a test.
You're building a massive web of context. Okay, so there's one more piece of real-world execution for the sources that I found really interesting, and it's about protecting your energy.
This is a huge one. Mental energy is finite.
Right, and Hoggy is very active on the social platform Gab, where he interacts with learners. But as we all know, the internet is full of rude trolls.
Unfortunately, yes.
So his policy is incredibly strict. He doesn't argue with them. He doesn't try to correct them. He just immediately blocks them. The source actually mentioned him blocking about 30 people right away.
Just completely curating them out of his space.
Yeah, exactly, to maintain a polite, positive environment for learning. So what does this all mean? When I look at all these pieces, blocking internet trolls, taking a lie-making class, writing like Hemingway, it feels like we're curating our own mental inputs the same way we curate a social media feed.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it all comes down to intentionality. All these disparate tips share that single theme.
Intentionality, I like that.
Yeah, because language learning or mastering anything really isn't just a passive academic exercise. It is an active lifestyle design.
You have to build the ecosystem around yourself to succeed.
Exactly. You are protecting your environment, protecting your attention, and setting up scenarios where the learning happens naturally.
So to summarize the core takeaways for the listener today, if you want to accelerate your success, you need to create massive intensity to kickstart that initial motivation.
Right. Get those quick wins.
But then, you must schedule strategic periods of rest to avoid crashing and burning out.
The off-season?
Yep. And finally, you have to ruthlessly curate your environment, whether that's blocking negativity, changing your inputs when you're bored, or finding shared hobbies, so that the whole process feels like effortless effort.
It's a powerful blueprint. And again, this applies to whatever you are trying to master right now, not just a new language.
Absolutely. Treating your learning process like an athletic training cycle can drastically change your results. So as we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
What's the thought?
Well, if this concept of effortless effort is truly the key to mastering the hardest challenges, what is one area of your life right now where you are currently forcing things too hard?
Oh, that's a good question. Where is the friction?
Exactly. Where's the friction? And how could you redesign your environment to make that effort feel more like play while still getting maximum results?
That is definitely something to think about.
It is. Well, thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.